Wish present. Oh, I think Dr. Mažvydas is here, and Lukas should join us hopefully as soon as well. Nice to see you.
Nice to be here. Hello to everyone. We will wait for Lukas, I think.
Right, great. And then we can start in a couple of minutes. The agenda is very simple, just to remind you also that I'll just briefly introduce the event and introduce myself, and then I'll give floor to Professor Gagachi and His Excellency the Ambassador, and then we'll give about 20 minutes for presentation. And then Professor Nodia kindly agreed to give his comments for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open floor for discussions. And hopefully in 1 hour, 15 minutes, we should be done for today's event.
Very good.
Wonderful. Wonderful. I see Lukas is also here, but let's wait perhaps like 2-3 minutes more, since usually people tend to join quite late, and then we can start in 3-4 minutes, unless somebody minds.
Что-то სასაუბრო ენა ინგლისურია ხო მე როგორც
Patron Cornelio.
ინგლისურად საუბრობთ ხო?
Yeah, English right. All right, I guess we can start since most of all the panelists are here, and hopefully people will join also. And just another small remark, we are also going live on Facebook, so those who won't be able to join the Zoom meeting can also watch our live stream on Facebook. Welcome again, thanks for joining, and thank you for being present at this event. I'll briefly introduce the event. It is hosted by the Georgian Institute of Politics and with the generous support of the Embassy of Lithuania to Georgia and Lithuanian Development Corporation. And His Excellency Ambassador is also present at the event, and it's very much appreciated. As you know, Georgia just finished the election cycle, and we are entering the post-election period. And as never before, the talks about the coalition, cooperation between political parties has been relevant. I mean, it always has been relevant, but in the post-election period is especially relevant as we pass through this polarized environment. Now political parties have to start working together on the issues that are relevant for the citizens' population. In that sense, the case of Lithuania is a very interesting case, and that is also the presentation is going to be about, and also the paper which will be published, co-authored by the distinguished scholars, Lithuanian scholars, which I'll briefly introduce. In that sense, it's relevant and interesting case for Georgia, and we have a lot hopefully to learn. And as I mentioned, the authors are Dr. Mažvydas Jastramskis, and again, apologies for my Lithuanian pronunciation. I might be butchering a little bit, but I'll try my best. And Dr. Lukas Pukelis. Dr. Jastramskis is Associate Professor at the Institute of International Relations and Political Science at Vilnius University, Lithuania. And he extensively writes about party politics, especially in the Lithuanian case. And personally, I found quite interesting his 2019 article for Parliamentary Affairs regarding the effects of the mixed electoral system. And that is personally for me interesting because Georgia had a very similar system just recently. And I think a lot of the benefits or disadvantages of this system, which he describes in this article, is very relevant for democracies like Georgia, and I personally found it quite enjoyable read. And also Dr. Lukas, who I know from my PhD studies as well, because we finished the same university, and we were teaching a course together, and Professor Petai was Lukas's supervisor, so I know him also informally, and it's very nice to see Lukas here today as well. But I myself, I forgot to introduce myself. I am a junior policy analyst at the Georgian Institute of Politics, and I will moderate today's event and try to allocate the time, control the time, and then open the floor for discussion and Q&A by the end of the presentation. But for now, I'll give the floor to Professor Kakachia for his introductory remarks, and then His Excellency the Ambassador, and then we can move to the presentations. Thank you again, and Professor Cornelius.
Thank you, Shota, for interesting introduction. Let me welcome you on behalf of Georgian Institute. I'm somewhere between Mtskheta and Gori, probably. So this is my first introduction from the car, as I was in last few days in Western Georgia, which is I think is very interesting in these days, especially after the election. Probably most of you know, but maybe our Lithuanian speakers, they don't know that there's one region actually where opposition mayor candidate actually won the election, and also there's some areas actually where opposition actually may be able to have a majority in the city council. So it's very interesting and challenging time, and that's why I was thinking that this discussion is very timely, and I would like to thank Lithuanian Embassy and the Lithuanian Development Agency for this help to organize this meeting, because we thought that this is something which Georgia needs right now. Because as far as I remember, when we talking and approaching to Georgian politicians, and when we talk about the needs of the some sort of like consensus-based politics, everybody agrees on that, but everybody says that this is not possible in Georgia, because Georgia is a special case. There's the evil another side, and they are the good side. So. And because of that, that's not possible, which we simply don't agree. And we don't think that Georgia is exception in any way. Of course, we don't have the political culture which supports this consensus-based politics. At least this was not the part last 30 years, but it doesn't mean that Georgia is unique and we cannot build here the coalition governments or to push towards more consensus-based politics. So that's why we thought that this Lithuanian case would be very interesting, because if you bring this case from, I don't know, Switzerland or Austria, they may tell you that, okay, this is very good, but that's not really country with post-Soviet heritage and with post-Soviet culture. So actually, in that sense, Lithuania is a very good model in many ways for Georgia, and especially in this term, it actually fits quite well. So that's why we really wanted to have this, I would say, case study. This basically to introduce it to Georgian audience, and especially political players, which we are going to do tomorrow when we have this meeting with the young people. And I think this will be very important for many of us. And I really appreciate the the work which was done to produce this paper, and I hope we will have a nice discussion. Thank you very much again, and I hope to see you at some point later today or tomorrow. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Pukelis. And now I'll give floor to His Excellency, the Ambassador Andrus Kalindrep, and for his welcoming remarks. The floor is yours, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much for inviting and for cooperating with the Embassy of the Republic of Lithuania, and big thanks goes to the Georgian Institute of Politics, definitely here. As Professor Cornelia Kakachi just mentioned, that is it indeed the exceptional case Georgia or not? Of course it's not, but at the same time, nothing works if it's imposed. So that's why the key component of this exercise is to present Lithuanian model and Lithuanian case, I would say, of building up all the coalitions. If not mistaken, since 1992, none of the previously existing governments or the main coalition parties were re-elected in Lithuania. So since 1992, we every 4 years we do have the different government, other leaders, other heads of the government, and even though there were very good times in terms of the social and economic development, etc., but still the people, to some extent, they get used to this kind of changes. And then also definitely demographics does work in every country, including in Lithuania. And this is very important that the youth participation in politics would be continuing in every country. As you are well aware, let me just to point out that indeed there is big attention in Lithuania for everything what is happening in Georgia. I would say that the future of Georgia is in our national security interest, and among the political leaders, society, media, all the developments are very closely monitored in Lithuania. And being same small country, we do understand that adherence to the United Nations Charter and then some of the key clauses like territorial integrity, sovereignty, this is kind of premature, like a chapeau of international rule of law. So, and in order to ensure this definitely the strong and resilient political system has to be built. And it goes not only for politicians themselves to be responsible, it goes also for the population, for the people to be demanding against politicians. In a way, it would be high up reputation for the country, for the system, and for the future. Definitely the article that has been produced has been written by two distinguished analysts and professionals of the political sciences is very much interesting, and then many key elements are drawn here. Let me just point out a few of them. One of them is the role, in accordance to our constitution, the role of the president in the formation of the coalitions. It proved its own leverage, and it proves its own relevance in the political system. Regarding the consensus, right now, not just right now, but for the last 10, 20 years, I would say that there is overall consensus on how we do assess the previous past, the Soviet past. This is very much important in order just to step into the ongoing and future relationship with the one big number neighbor that is up north or down to the east. So here it's one of the key components, I would say. So the reputation, credibility of the political parties, the leaders, and reputation, credibility of the political ambitions. Without ambitions, probably nothing goes in a way that the people would demand. So this is on my part. Once again, thank you very much, and I'm looking forward so much for the presentation and comments by professors. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. And Lithuania is a great friend of Georgia, and I believe we have a lot to learn from Lithuanian experience. And this paper is just another example, which would be an interesting lesson for Georgians. And without further ado, I will now give the floor to our distinguished authors. And you have about 20 minutes, and you could distribute the time the way you would like to, whether it's half-half or one of you would like to speak. It's absolutely up to you. Thank you again.
I would like to start from saying thank you for the Georgian Institute of Politics for inviting us, me and Lukas, to write this paper and to share some insights from Lithuania that may help, or at least give some information about the coalitional building practices. In Lithuania, I would like to thank the Embassy of Lithuania and Mr. Ambassador for taking interest in this research. And I thought about how should I start this presentation, because I have to admit this aim, to give some insights that could be maybe transferred into recommendations based on Lithuanian experience and how to transfer them into the Georgian context. It's challenging. And I thought about, the general wisdom from the research of the social and political sciences, that basically you can try and you can change a political regime in 6 months, but for the societal norms to change, it takes much, much more, maybe like 50 or 60 years. So the basic question here, how long does the changes in the political elite take? And how can we achieve that? Nevertheless, I think that given this quite deep polarization in Georgian politics, and from what I understand, the quite high degree of unwillingness of political parties and political leaders to cooperate in the coalitions and the multi-party alliances, I very much agree with Professor Corneli Kakachia that a country with relatively similar ex-communist backgrounds, such as Lithuania, these examples may facilitate some, at least talks, at least some spread of the narratives regarding the consensus building. And in this paper, we give an overview of governmental coalitions and consensus politics in Lithuania, altogether trying to at least give, some explanations and some mechanism that enhances and facilitate these coalitional practices. So if you let me, I have this short presentation that I can share with you, just to make our presentation a little bit more, let's say, understandable. And please give me 1 minute.
And meanwhile, I'll just briefly also remind the audience that in case you have questions to the panelists, you can always write them in the chat. And then we'll have a separate round where if you raise your hand, you will be able to also ask them verbally. I'll mute myself for now.
Of course, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Shota. And as I understand, everybody can see the presentation. Yeah, the slides, thank you. Okay, so as you may already all know, Lithuanian party system, and as Mr. Ambassador emphasized quite precisely, Lithuanian party system is characterized both by some stable patterns and both by electoral change and some instability at the electoral level. And when trying to structure our paper, we try to focus on like key parts regarding the coalitional building and the factors behind it. So we try to more focus on this political arena and the relations between the political elite. Nevertheless, if you have like any questions about the electoral behavior, about the voting for like older or new parties, I am more than happy to answer this after the presentation, because I have some background in the electoral research of the vote choice of Lithuanian voters. In this paper, we focus on several key points. So we start from the overview of Lithuanian cabinets. We then touch agreements that are not per se coalitional, but they cover like almost all major political parties in the parliament. So these, as I as I borrow this a term from the American politics, with so much so-called across the aisle party agreements between opposition and governments. We also touched a little bit on the electoral system, which I suppose which was quite similar between Georgia and Lithuania, but Georgian political which changed before the last elections. When we touched a little bit on the party ideologies, and when I will switch to Lukas, he will talk about the coalitional agreements, about the shadowing of ministers, some practices that helps to keep the coalitions alive, and sometimes even across a 4-year term. And Lukas will finish with some insights and maybe recommendations. So let's delve more into the Lithuanian party system and cabinets. Yeah, there are a lot of words in this table, but actually there's a key to navigate between them, because basically, when we are talking about the Lithuanian party system, especially in the 90s, we can see that there's a competition between these two poles. First pole is ex-communist left, the LDP, Lithuanian Democratic Labour Party. It's a party that's basically a reformed communist party. Of course, in Lithuania, the Communist Party had like 200,000 of members, and LDP had like 20,000 of members, but still you can trace, the politicians, especially the leadership of Algirdas Mykolas Brazauskas, from the communist to this reformed center-left party. Later, the LDP, the ex-communists, they merged with Social Democrats in Lithuania, and as you can see, a lot of governments in Lithuania later were led by the Social Democratic Party. On the right side of the spectrum, we have the descendants from the Lithuanian very broad umbrella type independence movement Mažvydas, and basically we have on the right the governments that were led by the Homeland Union, Lithuanian conservatives. Later, we merged with Christian Democrats, and right now it's like this a little bit confusing pattern in Lithuanian politics. We have Christian Democrats, but we call them conservatives because they used to be called conservatives, and right now, well, official name is Christian Democrats. But as you can see, the competition is basically between left and right, and despite that, as Mr. Ambassador emphasized, we never had the same government like re-elected, but the main poles of competition, we remain quite stable, either governments led by ex-communists and later the general left by Social Democrats, either governments led by the conservatives and Christian Democrats, with one major exception. In 2016, we had this breakthrough of very successful, relatively, let's call them previously marginal party of Farmers and Greens. And at least for last 5 years, this party, Farmers and Greens, we changed, like replaced the Social Democrats as the main pole in the center and center-left spectrum. As you can see, we had it all. We had all kinds of coalitional parties. We had one-party majorities, but only for the first 4 years of the ex-communist LDP. It was the last time. After that, we either had the oversized or usually minimal winning coalitions. We have some minority governments, only one case of one-party minority and another case of the Kirkilas government that was a minority coalition. When we are talking about these more broader, let's call it across the aisle party agreements, we have to emphasize that the transition between the different governments was quite peaceful from the onset. So basically there's a consensus from the start, and some political scientists in Lithuania call it like this pact between the ex-communists and anti-communists, And this pact covers this like peaceful alternation between the different governments and the general transition of Lithuania to the liberal democracy. So even though we had, especially in the 90s, we had this quite sharp cleavage, both at the society and both at the leader levels, between the so-called winners of the transition and so-called losers of the transition to the free market and to the democratic regime. But still, despite that, we had this more general consensus that the political process and especially the transition between different powers should be peaceful. Of course, and as Mr. Ambassador mentioned, we had consensus on some Western orientation. The first consensus emerged on the membership at the European Union. And here I have to emphasize that from the onset of independence, this aim was claimed not only by the right-wing powers like these descendants of the anti-communist movement, but also by the ex-communist left, and especially their leader and first directly elected president of Lithuania, Algirdas Brazauskas. In early 1994, Brazauskas sent a letter with an official claim by Lithuania to become a NATO member. However, there still remain some splits inside the left parties, and well, we have some agreements. We have this official stance of Lithuania to become a NATO member. However, very important agreement was achieved in 2001, where representatives from as many as 11 Lithuanian parties reaffirmed and signed the strategic goals of Lithuanian defense policy and commitment to the NATO membership. It's quite interesting that one of the leaders of the left, Gediminas Kirkilas, he said to me in one of the expert interviews that I carried on in my research regarding the presidents and other institutional trends in Lithuania. So he said that basically the left leaders had to convince their party members, to sign this agreement. So right here we have this very important role of some political leaders, to achieve consensus inside the parties, to have that consensus across the parties. And another quite important across the aisle agreement was reached in 2014 in the context of the military aggression of Russia against the Ukraine and Crimea annexation. So 7 major Lithuanian parliamentary parties, including the Polish alliance that usually holds quite pragmatist views towards Russia, all the 7 parliamentary parties agreed upon a goal to achieve 2% of the gross domestic product devoted to the defense by 2020. And again, here I have to emphasize that the leadership and pressure from another, this time non-partisan President-elect Grybauskaitė was very much important for such an agreement. If we turn to the electoral system and to the reasons behind the coalition politics and other reasons behind this consensus politics, there's some interesting patterns in Lithuania. As you may already know, Lithuania's electoral system has 2 equal-sized tiers. We have half of the parliament that is elected according to a proportional system, and another half of the parliament that is elected in the single-member district. Here's a little tiny mistake. Here should be 71 and here's 70. So sorry for that, but basically we're almost equal sized. And as you can see, almost in all elections, the winner of elections received more seats in the single member districts than in the proportional tier. Basically in 1996 and especially important in 2016, the winning party could have had a single party majority if elections were held only in single member districts. So I wanted to emphasize the 2016 election because the Farmers and Greens, they were very successful in single member districts, but the proportional tier brought them down. And we had to form a coalition with the Social Democrats to to form a cabinet. So as we all know, Georgia transitioned into the proportional system, but again, the insight is here quite important, that more proportional electoral reforms, and there are some ways, to make a proportional system even more proportional. This has to be taken into mind. The proportional system, it's a very simple relationship, but still, proportional systems lead to multi-party politics and coalitional governments. Of course, there are some exceptions. Turning into party ideologies, as I mentioned before, Lithuanian party system, it resembles this moderate pluralism. We have fragmentation in the parliament, usually around 6 or 7 parties, but it has to be emphasized that usually we have this relevant, anti-system, anti-democratic parties. And of course, we have polarization, especially in the early 90s, and again, it was especially associated with the cleavage regarding the evaluation of the Soviet times. But on the other hand, the social and economic policies of the main political parties and the left and right alternating governments, they have been quite similar and chance comparison. Again, very, very important unifying factor has been and still is positive attitudes towards the European Union. Another factor is that, as Aina Ramonaitė in her recent research article states, Lithuanian parties, at least until the 2020 election, had quite low attitudinal cohesions inside the political parties. So basically what I'm trying to say, that if we take Social Democrats, or if we take Christian Democrats, or even Farmers and Greens, inside those parties, we find a quite large spread of ideological positions. If you take conservatives, you can find very conservative politicians, but you can also find very liberal politicians inside that party. So what does that mean? I'm not trying to say, that the Lithuanian parties does not differ. They differ according to some of their average policy position, but there is a significant overlap. And the outcome is that in some parliamentary voting, sometimes even is very important parliamentary votings, the government may lean on the help of some of the oppositional members, because there is some overlap according to some issues. And on the other hand, as Ramonaitė also emphasizes, and as we see in the other research, there is a growing consensus of major parties on the evaluation of Soviet past and Russia in the last decades. I can cite the Aina as my colleague that her research is very much in the same area in the parties and voters. She states that attitudes of the 4 largest parliamentary parties, the Farmers and Greens, the Christian Democrats, the Social Democrats, and the Liberals, are indeed clearly anti-Soviet. So basically, we have consensus on these issues too. And again, another consensus, as I already mentioned 3 times, but it's very important, is retained on the European Union orientation. According to our last research on the ideologies of Lithuanian parties, there are no major parliamentary parties that would be clearly against the European Union. Well, Farmers and Greens takes this centrist position, but they are not against, more in the soft skeptical in the center. So here I would like to stop and give a word to Lukas. He will talk more about the coalition agreements and the shadow ministers and the recommendations, of course.
Hello, everyone. Thank you once again for the opportunity to present our work. In my section of the presentation, I would like to focus a bit more on the inner dynamics of a coalition and basically certain steps or certain institutions that are used to make coalitions work. As Mažvydas pointed out in his section, most of the cabinets that were in office in Lithuania over the last couple of decades, they were coalitions. But despite having, large number of coalitions, it by no means mean that these coalitions had an easy tenure, that they had it easy. And in fact, if you look at how these cabinets actually governed, most of them ended in some sort of a failure, which led to the premature collapse of a cabinet. And it was only in 2012 that the first coalition more or less successfully governed for a full 4-year term. And basically, this is very natural, because since coalitions are made up of multiple parties, there is always this uncertainty, always this feeling that each coalition partner will try to pull the proverbial blanket his own way, that they will try to somehow get ahead at the expense of others. And this uncertainty can be very unappealing. And basically, to combat it, coalition cabinets in Western Europe and of course in the Baltic states as well, we use a number of mechanisms that can basically make governing together a bit easier and a bit less uncertain. And one of these mechanisms is coalition agreements. As trivial as it may sound, just agreeing beforehand what you are going to do and committing to certain policy steps in written form is a very good way to keep coalition partners in line. Because not only that agreement sort of allows and cements the expectations coalition partners have for each other, since these agreements are usually made public, they can also allow to communicate these things to the voters. So if a coalition cabinet splits up, I mean, then different coalition partners cannot offer widely diverging narratives of what happened. And also coalition agreements can help the public to see what was agreed before and basically see who fault was it if a particular coalition cabinet has collapsed. Basically, both in Lithuania and in all 3 Baltic states, we observe a tendency that over time, coalition agreements, they have increased in the length and in the level of detail. Mažvydas, I think you can switch to another slide. And basically, in the beginning, we see that coalition agreements would mostly focus on the inner dynamics of a coalition. How often would coalition partners meet, how they would make decisions, who gets which ministry, who gets which position, and basically how they arrive at a sort of a joint consensus of what to do. But with time, we see that coalition agreements expand and we start covering policy provisions more and more. And with last few coalition agreements, we almost see that the entire government program first is sort of drafted as a coalition agreement, and then it only goes to the parliament as a government program. So coalition agreements really help, because if coalition partners take time to talk through what we are going to do, what we are trying to achieve, it can really be a very good preventive measure to prevent conflicts or scandals or potential collapse of a coalition cabinets. Okay, next slide, please. But yeah, coalition agreements, they are good at basically just communicating and agreeing on what to do. But there always is this feeling that a coalition partner might commit or agree to do something and then actually end up not doing that thing that they promised. That a particular minister might be inclined to cheat or do something corrupt and so on. And for that reason, in the coalitions, alongside the coalition agreements, usually you have some sort of a ministerial oversight. And that essentially means that a minister from one coalition partner is overseen by a representative from another coalition partner. And this can take many forms. For instance, in some cabinets, we have junior ministers. So basically, vice ministers or ministerial secretaries appointed from other coalition partners. And in some cabinets, we had basically chairs of corresponding parliamentary committees being from another party. So, for instance, Minister of Defense would be overseen by the chair of a parliamentary committee for defense. And also in some cases, we have cabinets which extensively used both measures. And also this applies not only for Lithuania, but for Estonia. And basically we see that absolute majority of cabinets had absolute majority of ministers overseen by one manner or another. And basically when you deal with literature on the subject, you always find this simple maxim that trust among coalition partners is good, but control and certainty is better. So having this control, having this certainty is definitely one of the things how coalitions can be more cohesive and how we can reduce this uncertainty, which can bring coalition cabinets down. Yeah. Next slide, please. And yeah, moving to the final part, the recommendations, I would like to briefly summarize the key points from the Mažvydas presentation and also my section. So the first point was that in Lithuania, a number of times we saw that the consensus politics were enhanced by by leadership, by leaders of political parties and also presidents. Having presidents with no strong party affiliation also helped to forge more lasting consensus policies among coalition partners. Additionally, consensus politics in Lithuania were aided by the fact that there was a widely shared agreement on the goals, or at least the long-term orientation of the country, which was Euro-Atlantic integration into EU and NATO, and also this desire to maintain Western political orientation of Lithuania. And since no party actively contested that, that formed a very stable common ground on which parties could build further consensus. Also, consensus is often a product of necessity. And in Lithuania, we saw that quite often elections would create a situation where no single party would have a very dominant position. Rather, we would have, of course, some bigger parties which would emerge out of elections, but but also several smaller yet relatively strong parties. And this meant that basically going alone was not an option, and there was a very strong or inevitable need to form alliances between the political parties and also establish more or less more strong or traditional partnerships between different political parties. For instance, we observe it in Lithuania. Lithuanian Conservative Party, which is the biggest party on the right, is traditionally very much inclined to cooperate with the Liberal Party, which is a bit smaller right-wing party, but they have been together in office for several cabinets now. Moving on, coalitions can be also enhanced by certain institutions which reduce the uncertainty between coalition partners, like coalition agreements, which help to coalition partners to communicate what we are going to do beforehand, and also publicly commit to a specific policy measures or policy goals. In addition to this public commitment between partners, it's always good to have some sort of oversight, just to see that this agreement which was made between the coalition partners is actually kept, that nobody is cheating, and basically that have some way to oversee the ministers, hoping that when ministers feel such oversight from their coalition partners, they would act appropriately and will not try to cheat. So this is basically it. This concludes our presentation, and of course we would welcome any comments, questions, and of course feedback. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for such an interesting talk, Dr. Jastramskis and Dr. Pukelis, and thank you. I'm looking forward to your paper being published on our website at some point, and will be available for public to read as well. And I'll give a floor now to Professor Ghia Nodia from Ilia State University, who kindly agreed to provide some comments on your paper, and then we'll open the floor for discussion. I already see one question in the Q&A, and I encourage audience to write their questions in chat or in Q&A section. But for now, Professor Nodia, the floor is yours. You have about 10 minutes for your comments.
Thank you, Shota. I want to thank and congratulate the Georgian Institute of Politics on this very interesting, organizing this very interesting event. And of course, our Lithuanian colleagues and as well as sponsors, as represented by the embassy. So my role as a discussant is to contest something, but I can hardly contest anything said about Lithuanian politics for obvious reasons. However, this paper is written based on an assumption that there are some parallels or lessons to be learned by the Georgian political elite from Lithuanian experience. And so if I contest some, I will contest certain things, but I will contest certain assumptions or presumptions about Georgian politics, whether or not they are expressed in the paper. Of course, this paper does not speak anything about Georgian politics next to anything, but we have some assumptions in Georgia about how can we move in the direction of coalition politics. I think we have high demand for coalition politics in Georgia, at least let's say so, political elite, broadly understood policy elite, not just political parties, but politically active citizens expect Georgian politics to go into the direction of coalition politics, but it's not happening, and we are dissatisfied with that, and that's why we also want to learn from Lithuanian experience. So, but what is the reason why we don't have coalition politics, unlike Lithuanian case? So that's basically the issue here. And okay, in this text, the written text which I received as a discussant before the conference, there is a sentence which relates to Georgia, that maybe the reason for this lack of coalition politics is in the unwillingness, and I quote, unwillingness of political parties to cooperate in the multi-party alliances. Now, I'm not sure this is right. This creates an impression that the problem is in the leadership of different parties who don't want to cooperate in coalition. However, in fact, our political parties frequently cooperate, but usually in opposition alliances against the ruling party. And in that, they can be quite pragmatic. And we often see very different people who in the past have held extremely different positions on specific issues and have been rather hostile to each other, but then they cooperate in alliances. And we are sometimes surprised how these people can be together today, while yesterday they were sort of arch enemies and said nasty things about each other. So I think if it comes to pragmatic coalitions, especially when they are coalitions against somebody, we are not that bad. And we have numerous examples of this cooperation also this year. So the problem is, and Lukas mentioned it, that coalitions are kind of children of necessity, not of goodwill among parties, not that because parties or leaders like each other, and that's why they create coalitions. No, they create coalitions because they have no other way. So if a political party can rule without a coalition, it will. And if an opposition party feels it can defeat the incumbent party on its own, it will not ally with other opposition parties. But coalitions are created when this is impossible. If a single political party has no majority in parliament, then it will create a coalition because that's the only option for creating government. And if there is no single opposition party that is strong enough to take on the government candidate, so it will have to ally with other opposition parties because otherwise it does not have a chance. So we saw this in just now in the second round of municipal elections in the big cities, where opposition created sort of pre-election coalitions. So of course there was clear leader of UNM, United National Movement, but they knew that without attracting supporters of other opposition parties, they did not have a chance, and they created some kind of spirit of coalition and a promise of coalition. And it worked to some extent. It did not work, they could not win, but it was very close. We never had coalition government because we never had to. I mean, one should make this note that sometimes people say that we had coalition government after 2012, but I think it's a mistake. It was a pseudo coalition or quasi coalition. Georgian party was called, there was Georgian party the party, but also it was part of the coalition also called Georgian Dream together with 4 or 5 other parties. But in reality, there was only one party, which was Bidzina Ivanishvili's party. Whether you call it coalition or just party, sort of Georgian Dream proper, it did not matter because Georgian Dream won elections because of Ivanishvili. And whether or not Republican Party or Conservative Party or whatever other parties were there would be in coalition, or some other parties would be instead in that coalition, did not really matter. And everybody recognized that as a fact. So all these smaller coalition parties were dispensable. Ivanishvili could dispense with them, could rule without them, and he eventually did. So during this 4 years period, this coalition some of them, these coalition partners sort of dropped out, and nothing changed. We only will have coalition governments when the results of elections will make it inevitable, and so far this has never happened. So this is the real immediate problem. So the question is why, and many people in Georgia, including many policy analysts, think that this is because of the electoral system. And I'm not saying that this is not important. Electoral system, of course, is important, but it's not the decisive factor, I would argue. And the Lithuanian example, actually, and this paper shows this extremely well, because the Lithuanian system is very similar to what we had until recently, with almost half of the seats distributed through majoritarian districts and other half through a proportional system. But in Georgia, we had that, and the proportional component even had greater kind of advantage in numbers, but we never had a situation where there was a necessity to create a coalition. And also in the Lithuanian case, the majoritarian component as the paper showed, happen to benefit stronger parties, which is natural. It's kind of ABC of political science, that majoritarian systems are better for stronger parties and can increase chances of actually two-party systems. But it was still never overwhelming from the spreadsheet we saw. Yes, it is somewhat better for the winning party. The winning party has a little bit better results in majoritarian component, but it's not overwhelming difference. While in Georgia, with very few exceptions, the incumbent party carries all or almost all majoritarian districts, and we are very much used to it. That's why it was so important for kind of pro-democracy forces to insist on fully proportional system, because incumbent party is expected to win always or almost always the majoritarian part. And of course, people hope that with a purely proportional system, with low threshold, will lower than in Lithuania. It is 5% in Lithuania, as we had until recently, so that coalition governments will be unavoidable. And I hope probably it will be eventually, but so far at least our experience does not show that conclusively. So in the last parliamentary elections of 2020, we were quite close to proportional system, with a very low threshold of 1%, and 80% of all seats distributed based on proportional system. But if we take the official results of the proportional part of the vote only and forget about all those 30 seats, the remaining 30 seats, majoritarian seats that the incumbent GD party carried, GD could basically was only one. If we imagine that only those 120 MPs elected from proportional lists constituted the parliament, GD was only one mandate short of overall majority, even in that system. So the system is important, but it's not kind of panacea. So what is the reason then? I would venture to say that this is the nature of political parties and the party system, which is so much different from Lithuanian and many other cases of more advanced democracies, I would say. And again, I will mention this very popular topic of political party polarization, and many people believe that it's a major problem. And I'm not saying it is wrong, but I think it needs some elucidation. There is a problem behind this. We have this respected research organization, Georgia, CRRC, and they published a paper that contended that political polarization in Georgia is a myth. It does not exist, which is certainly counterintuitive claim, but they based this on results of a survey that failed to detect substantive changes in differences, in policy opinions between supporters of the GD and UNM. So, both parties don't have basically so much different political platforms. Our Lithuanian colleagues mentioned consensus on NATO and EU membership aspirations. I mean, in our case, it's only aspiration. Well, we have that consensus too, and sometimes it was expressed in joint declarations of parliament supported by both parties. But this did not help in overcoming what we call polarization. So if we define the term polarization in the way Western political scientists define it, then CRRC is probably right. There is no political polarization in Georgia because there is no polarization around policy opinions or values, or at least CRRC failed to detect these differences. Maybe it's their problem, maybe they did not ask the right questions. I guess maybe there is greater difference than CRRC managed to detect. For instance, there was only one question where there was a valid difference between supporters of UNM and GD. UNM supporters were much more likely to support LGBT rights, which is, I think, indicative of something. And if you maybe go deeper with better questions, you find more differences. But still, there is no obvious policy differences, let's say so, on most questions. And so if this polarization is very different than, for instance, polarization between Democrats and Republicans in the United States, which is also a very big problem for their democracy. So, so what is the problem then if it's not polarization in traditional sense? On the face of it, it's not just polarization, but rather intolerance, expressed as refusal to accept political pluralism. Especially by the ruling party, although one can say that opposition rhetoric is also quite radical often. And I'm not saying that this is unique for this current ruling party. Arguably, the UNM, the previous ruling party, was also not too nice to the opposition. But I think the GD brought this intolerance to the new height. So for it, opposition is kind of formally acceptable in general terms, but this opposition, specific opposition, is considered criminal. That's what they usually say. So the objective of the ruling party is not to defeat that enemy and win elections, but to destroy the opposition party. The most important, basically, all of the really existing opposition, not just UNM. So the best recommendation based on the Lithuanian experience, which is mentioned in the paper, may be that the new government should not be so keen to imprison the leaders of the previous one. So if we go to root causes of this intolerance, I would say that we have just on the one hand dominant party system and major political parties that depend on personalities. One can have dominant party system without this so personalistic politics, but we have it also very personalistic. And in this system, most people trust personalities of leaders rather than parties, because parties are just organizations that are built around leaders. And so party platforms don't really matter. And when this politics is so personalistic, I think it's also kind of vindictive. You have to destroy another leader because this leader is so dangerous. And I think we see in Georgia that our politics is about fighting between these big leaders, Bidzina and Misha, Ivanishvili and Saakashvili, and somehow we cannot get away from this vicious circle of one leader replacing another, one great leader, quote unquote, replacing another great leader. And as I mentioned, that will be my last sentence. Now we have strong demand in the kind of elite circles, I mean, not only political class, but also intellectual class and civil society, etc., for coalition politics, for overcoming this single party and single leader governments. And the rhetoric, for instance, of UNM in the last elections was very clearly that we don't want single party domination. It's very important for us to work with other parties, etc. But how much this new demand will kind of trickle down to the silent majority, which decides the outcome of elections, it remains to be seen, because I think that large majority of voters still sees the nature of contestation as a fight between two great leaders supported by their party machines created around them. Thanks a lot. That was my contestation.
Thank you very much, Professor Nodia. And indeed, I think your talk was an interesting complement, so to say, to what we've been hearing before, that like also Georgian perspective more in details, and why the Lithuanian case will be an interesting example in the lesson for Georgian politics. according to my agenda, we have about 15 minutes, maximum 20 left. And what I would suggest is we take a couple of questions, and then, in answering to these questions, you could also comment on what Professor Nodia has been saying, if you wish so, unless you have some immediate remarks you would like to make. I think it makes more sense if we collect also questions, right? At least two questions I see in the Q&A section, but before that, I'll abuse my power as a moderator and I'll ask the first question myself, if I may. So you talked about the system and the importance of the electoral system and whether they matter or not, but then there's also one dimension. I was wondering if that could somehow enforce consensus-based politics, and that is reforming the system of voting. Like, for instance, there are different types of voting system. There's this ranked voting, when voters are asked to rank different candidates, especially in majoritarian districts, and then they are forced to also vote for other parties, not only the party they really want to vote for. Do you think this kind of systems might actually inhibit, help to develop consensus-based, democracy, like from top to bottom rather than from bottom down? And then there are two other questions I'll read from the chat, and then I'll give floor to the speakers. So the first question is, what have been the main premises for building coalition in Lithuania, whether it's an ideology, personal links, balance of power, and what are the main limitations? The second question comes from Nino Samharadze, asking whether public demand was an important for the process of consensus-based democracy, how the social attitudes might enhance parties' appetite for the coalition. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for the questions, and thanks, Professor Ghia, for very comprehensive comment on the Georgian politics. If I may, I will answer quite shortly my stance on these questions, and then maybe Lukas will want to follow up. Regarding the ranked choice, actually, I read Professor Larry Diamond's book on the democracy in international level, but also on the USA, and it's his suggestion for the United States how to escape this polarization. And how to find the middle ground, and how to not to force but to engage citizens to vote for more middle range centered candidates. But I think that especially in such cases as Georgia, where you transitioned already to the proportional system, it would mean that you will change again completely the electoral system. And from what I know about the electoral reforms, first, we should be very carefully thought, and second, we should not be like every election, because I think it's worse, to have a different system every elections than to have one stable, moderately functioning electoral system. And also reacting to the professor's comment, actually it's very interesting how these effects of the mixed electoral system diverges, because in Lithuania we never had this effect, with an exception of 92 elections, that the mixed system would result in the very clear one-party majority, as exemplified with former examples in Georgia or even in Hungary, So basically, electoral system, it interacts with other factors in society, and well, actually mixed system is the best system. I'm sorry, I will be frank here. Mixed parallel system is one of the worst systems in the world, and I really, appreciate the efforts by the Georgians to go away from this system. Why? Because at least in Lithuania, it both results in a lot of wasted votes, and on the other hand, it does not reduce the fragmentation. So. And we have quite, sometimes unpredictable election results, especially due to second round in the single member districts. But enough about the electoral system. About the main premises for building coalitions in Lithuania. Well, one of the major premise is the practical necessity, as we already mentioned in a lot of examples here today. But again, if we are looking for these ideological similarities, if you would try to, explain Lithuanian coalitions by the traditional Western dimensions like economical left and right, you will not get a very sensible picture. And for example, before the last elections, if we take a median candidate, so a coalition that would make like the most sense would be between the Christian Democrats, between the populistic Labour Party, and between the farmers and Greens. In reality, we have a right coalition between conservatives and two liberal powers, and one of the major explanations is still evaluation of the Soviet past and attitudes towards the Russia and the East. And we have these cleavages, for example, like of relations with China, like opposition. It's not like Lithuanian oppositions are like pro-Russian. We are not. Whereas like consensus, on the defense policy, membership in NATO, etc. But still, there's some degree, how strict should be Lithuanian foreign policy, and how should we deal with the should be be more pragmatic in the relations with China and Russia, or should we be very, very much for the sanctions and non-cooperation. So yeah, there's some degree of differences, and one of the major premises for coalitions in Lithuania that the so-called center left, I would not call them center left in the traditional sense, because opposition in Lithuania right now, we are more authoritarian and more conservative than the current government, even we are left, so it's peculiarities of the post-communist context. And about the public demand for the consensus-based processes, actually in Lithuania, from election to election, you see the same pattern. If the political context become more polarized, at minimum at the personal level between the opposition and between the government. I will give you two examples. Like before the 2016 elections, we had this competition between social democrat left government and between the right-wing opposition. We don't have very major ideological polarization, but you had major clashes between the leaders, allegations of corruption against government, etc. And in the results, a new party, Lithuanian Farmers and Greens, that we said that we can cooperate both of another opposition of the government, will emerge in the center. Kind of similar processes are in the presidential elections, where presidents get elected, the ones that keep the distance both from the left and from the right, So basically in the society, even for Lithuanians are very much non-ideological. I mean, we do not have these divisions between the leftists, between the rightist groups, in the pure sense. We are much more, for the center-based, moderate politics. For a major part, of course, it regards the rhetorics of the politicians, just to be more moderate in their speeches and etc. So I know maybe Lukas would like to follow up to these questions, and we have another question, so maybe he wants to answer that.
Yeah, so basically, to follow up on what was already asked, in my opinion, electoral systems, they can definitely contribute to a better or worse outcome. But I mean, their effects are very far from universal, and they are not really the silver bullet which can fix all the country's problems. And as Professor Ghia Nodia just very accurately pointed out, even if you would count the purely proportional tier in the last Georgian election, still, I mean, one party dominates. So really, if there is this big societal demand for one party, I mean, you can alter the system all you want and still you get the same effect. I mean, of course, the system can increase it or decrease it, but still, I mean, the general pattern will be there. Moving to the second point about what is the driving force and the base for coalitions in Lithuania, I always remember this quote from the first president, Algirdas Brazauskas. We were elected to do a work, not to politicize, not to engage in empty politics. And this is basically the main motto for Lithuanians. This is the main sort of a leadership style they like. I mean, these pragmatic leaders who just sit down and get the job done. What people do not like is just basically long-lasting discussions about high political issues and so on. So there is this very strong social demand for basically quiet, pragmatic leadership and just simply doing the work. At least this is how the prime ministers and presidents try to position themselves most of the time. And this also covers the third question about the social demand. I mean, people really like pragmatic leaders.
Thank you very much for your interesting responses. I think there's one last question in Q&A, and that will be also the final question since we're slightly running out of time. And I think this is the question which also Professor Nodia could contribute if he would like to also express his opinion on this. And I'll read the question now. Why, despite similar communist heritage, Lithuania ended up with parties built around on social cleavages, while Georgia wound up with parties built around, to put it differently, but determined higher degree of party institutionalization of the Lithuanian parties, unlike those of Georgia. And I think here also Professor Nodia could contribute. So whoever wants to go first, the floor is yours.
To myself, so I cannot claim to have an answer to that question. That's too difficult question. I cannot say that you know, the answer is not about electoral systems, as I think also this Lithuanian paper showed us. It's not about kind of differences in economic development, I think. I think it's about political culture and political practice. I think from the very beginning of our independence movements, we had a kind of prevalence of radical mood. I remember that in Lithuania, and we looked at Baltic states as a kind of model, and there was Sąjūdis, of course, in the Baltic states, which was kind of all-embracing organization, including former communists or maybe communists initially, kind of reform-minded communists. And there were some very radical, small group, radical groups who was also against Sąjūdis and who was against taking part in Soviet elections, for instance. But in Lithuania, that was a marginal group. But in Georgian independence politics, it was a predominant group. So we are maybe so more impatient. We want to achieve, solve problems very fast, and by some extraordinary effort led by, and this effort needs, of course, some visionary leader. So that's created a vicious circle, and so far we fail to leave this vicious circle, so that we come to rely on great personalities, but then we get disappointed in that great personality and need another great personality to defeat the previous one. So it's a little bit, it's described, I think, well in Guillermo O'Donnell's old article, almost 27 years old, of delegative democracy. So people collectively delegate or their hopes to great leader, but then inevitably get frustrated, and this great man becomes great villain. And this is kind of cyclical, and I think we have these kind of cyclical policies.
Thank you much, Professor Nodia. Dr. Jastramskis, sorry again, or Pukelis would like to add something.
My insight would be a little bit correction to the question, because, well, Lithuanian political party system, of course, we try to to give very simplified. It's a very simplified picture right here, but it more resembles laboratory of very different party types. And the main social cleavage, initially and to some degree until these days, is based on basically this historical evaluation of the Soviet past, but also on the subjective, and I very much here need to stress the word subjective status of losers and winners, because it is correlated with the income, but the correlation is not very strong actually. And of course, we had the structuring of the party system, especially like in the first couple of elections, the structuring between the ex-communist and anti-communist parties. But the thing is that this social cleavage is not conducive to representation, because how can you represent the evaluations of the past? You cannot go like back to the Soviet Union, and on the other hand, it's breakup, and transition to the new regime. It's already a done deal. So what I'm trying to say, that Lithuanian political parties did not build very strong, did not capitalize very much strongly on the other social cleavages, such as the workers, like the representation of the religious minorities and majorities, etc. And right now we have, like, for example, some parties like New Freedom Party. We very much are based on the social cleavage of the younger generations that are more socially progressive and live more in the larger cities. But on the other hand, we have these parties like Labour Party, that we're not based on any like meaningful cleavage, especially with the exception that we attract more voters from the pro-Soviet, side. And well, in this landscape, we have some established party organizations like the Christian Democrats of the Social Democrats. On the other hand, we have these new parties. Like, well, last prime minister is a very good example. Our last prime minister, Saulius Skvernelis, he used to be a chief commissioner of the police, and he became a non-partisan minister in the Butkevičius government led by Social Democrats. He left the government to join the new so-called new party of the Farmers and Greens. He became a prime minister, and a couple of weeks ago, he again quit the parliamentary grouping of Farmers and Greens, and he claims to establish new party. So basically in Lithuania, we have it all. We have some social cleavages, we have some correlation with the evolution of Soviet past, we have some parties that we catch all about everything, we have some parties that appeal to the strong leader type, and have very, very populistic oriented leaders, like with connections, with Guillermo O'Donnell's type of the delegated democracy. So, well, it's really hard to say, how the party system in Lithuania will shape in the next 2 decades. And well, my answer to this question is that Lithuania democratized quite early, and we had this, consensus between the elite, to go towards the Western, to integrate into the Western structures. But on the other hand, the society, we had changed in very different speed, and we have right now very different types of people, and you cannot, just put them in like two sides, like one cleavage, So yeah, it's, as I call Lithuania, it's like still ongoing laboratory on the electoral choice and the political parties.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jastramskis. Unfortunately, we are really running out of time, so we have to end this very interesting discussion we had, and keep an eye out for our website, because soon the paper will be also uploaded, and I'm sure the public is really looking forward to that. And thank you very much again to the authors. Thank you very much to the Lithuanian Embassy, and very good friend of Georgia, and for supporting this project. And thank you very much for Professor Nodia, who agreed to serve a discussant today. And thank you those who've joined. And we continue this project tomorrow on a special workshop where Mr. Ambassador will be also present, and we're looking forward to meeting him in person as well. And again, thank you very much for joining, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye.